So, good morning, everyone. When I was asked to present on what if Netflix did advertising, I wanted to begin the presentation with a few caveats. Basically, I didn't want to risk coming across the world's least informed analyst. So I thought I'd begin with a few quotes on what Netflix has said publicly about moving into advertising. So I'm sure most of you will be aware that the company came under a bit of fire earlier this year when it started introducing some pre-roll trailers for other content in front of shows and movies on its service. And so they were forced to issue a few public statements about their intentions with regards to selling inventory. So from their corporate communications director, we're not planning to test or implement advertising on the Netflix service. From their CEO, no advertising coming onto Netflix, period, just adding relevant cool trailers for other Netflix content you like to enjoy. So far, not so good for a presentation about why Netflix might move into advertising. But one struck me as quite interesting is the final quote on this page. And this is different from the others in that the first two were targeted largely at the public. They were released on Twitter or via direct communications to media. This last one is from their investor communications and says, our brand, at least over the next couple of years, and at this point, really stands for that commercial-free experience that we have. So it's that caveat there that's interesting. So why at least over the next couple of years and at this point? So Netflix is obviously a listed firm, over 50 billion market cap. It's currently running at a run rate in relation to their operating income of over 100-fold. It's got double-digit multiples based on its revenue. And that is all predicated on its relatively high rate of growth currently. So if we look at Netflix's quarterly revenue and growth, you can see on the chart on the left, in the light blue line, we've got the US revenues steadily ticking up quarter on quarter, so ending at just over 1.2 billion, or just about 1.2 billion per quarter in Q3 2015. And then as that domestic growth has begun to slow through market saturation, we've started to see the international rollout kick in. And that's helped keep the growth high. So the dotted grey line on that is their year-on-year growth each quarter. And that's been running, at least for the last 2 years, pretty consistently at around about 15% year-on-year. But Netflix has a problem. In terms of the markets that it's rolled out into, it's already reaching the vast majority of broadband subscribers globally. So the markets that it's launched in represent the bulk of its potential addressable market around the world. And those territories which are left are predominantly the markets in which it's going to struggle a little bit more. So China hasn't launched in China yet. It intends to, but expects it to be a moderate prospect. So what that means is beyond 2016, when it's basically going to complete its global expansion, we'll be looking at problems for Netflix in terms of how it sustains that growth. So sustaining that growth is going to have to come not just from adding new users, but from expanding its business model. So that has many options here. It could introduce new subscription tiers. It could move into different types of content. But as we're at an advertising event, let's look at what might happen if they decided to bite the bullet and move into selling inventory on their current services. So in terms of what that inventory, what this could look like, let's look at some of the baseline statistics around Netflix. The average Netflix user is an extremely heavy TV and film watcher. So the chart here is basically illustrating the number of hours streamed per Netflix subscriber per day on average. So this is based on Netflix released data. So this isn't based on consumer research, or this is direct from the horse's mouth. So you can see that by the end of Q3 2015, the average Netflix account was streaming 2 hours on average of video per day. That's a staggering amount if you consider the typical broadcast viewing time of your average consumer is probably only about double that. And that's been increasing. So you can see, obviously, that's gone up since the end of 2011 from about just under an hour. From 2014, it's increased by half an hour. So substantial gains, even on a per subscriber base in terms of viewing. So their consumers are watching an awful lot of video. So if you stack that up, obviously Netflix has a smaller reach than the whole market. So in the US, they're hitting about 45% of of internet households in the UK. There are between 4 and 5 million subscribers. So if you translate those hours and the number of subscribers, what you get in terms of aggregate consumption. And if you look at the approximate annual hours viewed, so this is slightly back of the envelope, but hopefully should give you a good idea of the scale. In the US, the red bar in the middle, you can see that the aggregate number of hours consumed by viewers in the US for Netflix is pretty much equivalent to that of a major broadcast channel. So bear in mind the US media market's perhaps a little bit more fragmented, I suppose, than European in terms of viewing. We're about on parity in the US for Netflix. Now in the UK, it's still got a little bit of a way to go, but it's rapidly catching up with channels like Channel 4. So that would be the main channel, so we're not looking at all of the multi-channel properties, but not too far behind. So if you consider moving to advertising, there's an awful lot of potential inventory to sell there. You've got an awful lot of hours being viewed, you've got substantial numbers of subscribers. Now, the one thing it doesn't have in a few of the markets is reach. So in the US, you could argue that, well, Netflix does have reach. It's reaching half of households, or at least half of internet-connected households on a monthly basis. In the UK, that's perhaps not so true, so that's where the broadcasters still have an advantage. But certainly in the US market, its largest, it does have equivalent reach to some of the key broadcasters. So who are these viewers? Well, if you look at the age breakdown of a Netflix subscriber, and this is research we conducted a couple of months back, you can see that, as you'd expect, they'd skew young. So there's a skew particularly in the 18 to 24 and 25 to 34 age brackets. And that varies a little bit by country. You see more mature markets like the US, they have a slightly more mature age profile, and newer markets like Germany, France tend to skew slightly younger. But on the whole, it's as you'd expect. You've got early adopters picking up Netflix, and that's where the bulk of its customer base is. There's a slight male skew, but not significant. And in terms of who those people are, in terms of jobs, income, and so on, I think there's something quite interesting. Normally, when we look at these sorts of charts, you tend to find that income generally increases towards the middle years. So a service that's skewed young will generally not have necessarily the same high-income customer base, the high-income customer base that you might want to target as an advertiser. But Netflix is a little bit different, actually. So if we look at who their customers are from a demography standpoint, you've got on the right-hand chart here, looking at them relative to the average surveyed, 63% of them fell into the ABC1 category, relative to about 54% across those polled as a whole. So substantially more likely to fall into an ABC1 grouping. In addition, the chart on the left, the smaller one, is illustrating how much more likely they are to be in certain income brackets. So as you can see, it's skewed towards the higher income brackets, so 14% more likely to be in the 60 to 90,000 a year category, a whopping 43% more likely to be earning household income 120,000 to 150,000. So they're young, they're ABC1, they're earning a lot. So potentially quite attractive demographics for targeting advertising. So what might a move into advertising look like? Now, there are many ways that Netflix could do this, so we've considered just a handful. So the three I'll be exploring over the next few slides are effectively, what if it extended its trials from earlier this year? What if it took those pre-roll trailers for other content and said, well, actually, we're going to replace those now with adverts. We're going to sell inventory against those. So that's model one. Model two, let's go the whole hog. Let's stick pre-rolls, mid-rolls, fill it with a full broadcast ad load. What would that do? And lastly, what if we try not to annoy our subscribers too much and introduce maybe a free ad-supported tier? What would that look like, and what could that do? So let's start with the pre-roll model. So this is arguably, I think, least contentious from an existing business standpoint. You could argue that it's not going to annoy the customers too much by introducing a few pre-roll adverts. How much money might they make? Well, we've put a few figures in to plot out actually against those consumption numbers and the ad loads, how much money might they make. So if we assume that they're showing a single 30-second spot or equivalent prior to each show or movie, basically replacing those trailers, how much money did they make? So on the chart on the right, we're just taking their latest quarter's results. So what they're making on that, domestic subscription just over $1 billion each quarter, international subscription just over $500 million. And if you take it on the basis of maybe a $15 CPM for the pre-rolls, Netflix could be making about $270 million a quarter on current subscriber numbers and consumption volumes. And I want to stress that last point, on current subscriber number and consumption volumes. So about $1 billion a year in theory from this model. Okay, so they're making, again, about half as much as, or they could stand to make about half as much as they do from the international business right now. So what about the full broadcast style ad model? So filling Netflix full of breaks and adverts. And again, on current subscriber numbers, again, stressing that very hard at the moment, they could actually make quite a lot. So $1 billion, again, for their domestic subscription, $500 million for international subscription, $2 billion a quarter for advertising. So, and that's on an $8 CPM, so not an overly optimistic one, I feel. So something struck me when I did this, because I looked at the calculation, surely that's wrong. Why aren't they doing this already? Well, there are a few reasons for that, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And partly it comes back to that point about their current subscriber numbers and volumes and attitudes of existing Netflix subscribers towards advertising. So what would happen, though, if this hit? What if the worst case scenario emerged and Netflix suddenly flooded the market with inventory, premium inventory? Well, if you look at the TV ad market as a whole, in the UK and US, and express it in relation to GDP, you can see actually there's very little change over time. It's obviously heavily macroeconomically linked, but there's very little new money that's made available to TV advertising. A little bit comes in and goes out, but on the whole, it's pretty consistent year on year. Certainly history has shown us that when there are sudden inventory changes in the market, the market can't necessarily react to cope with that fully. So when some of the public service broadcasters in Europe moved or were forced to move away from advertising a few years ago, what we tended to find is that the commercial broadcasters could make up some of the gains, but couldn't necessarily make up all of them. Similarly, if you drop a load of that inventory into the market, you might find some spend coming in from other segments, so you might find some being pulled in from online or other sources. But broadly speaking, there is going to be an impact on rival companies. So flooding the market with inventory, not a good thing for other broadcasters. Who'd have thought? But of course, the thing that I haven't been talking about so far is what would happen to their existing customer base. So Netflix customers, as the quotes at the beginning indicated, are pretty advertising intolerant. So one of the reasons that Netflix was forced to issue some of those statements is largely in relation to the fact that there were so many protests about these, what they thought was the beginning of a new advertising trend. So the perhaps unfortunately named magazine, The Extremist, conducted a survey earlier in the year of Netflix subscribers about would you churn if Netflix introduced advertising. So that means half of them would cancel if it showed any advertising at all. At least that's what they said. Whether you believe that or not is a matter of taste. But if we look at some conditions for those scenarios I presented before, if we saw small amounts of churn, actually a pre-roll model doesn't look so attractive. So Netflix could sustain about 10% churn before the revenue overall would be impacted for a pre-roll model. So actually, that's pretty sensitive to churn. Similarly, the pre-mid-roll model, i.e. the full broadcast ad loads, would obviously also suffer an impact if subscribers churn. Now, the interesting thing about this one is Netflix can sustain potentially quite a lot of churn. So I've put something fairly dramatic and taken those customers at face value and said, what if half of them did churn? And actually, you can still see that on that basis, it's actually making a little bit more still from advertising. But once you take into account the costs associated with it and the fact that is it really going to be able to sustain the same levels of same prices if half its customers have suddenly gone, you could argue that those gains are cancelled out. So managing churn would be the number one priority if Netflix did make a move into advertising. So the final scenario is what if they moved into a free ad-supported tier? Now this one's, I think, a little bit more challenging from an analyst perspective to model because there are so many different ways this could pan out. Depends on the content, depends on where it's done, I suppose. So the advantages to doing it are you've got a whole pool of low spend or people who aren't currently spending on Netflix to tap into. So a whole set of new customers who haven't previously been interested in taking Netflix. You avoid angering your existing subscriber base with unwanted advertising, so no churn problem there. But of course, it does have some disadvantages, that it can't simply exploit its existing rights portfolio. So most of the rights will be governed for an existing subscription service and not for an ad-supported free service. In terms of some of the rights, they simply won't be able to license them to a free service. So if you look at Netflix's catalogue in the UK, about a quarter of the movies that they have on there are new released, released in the last couple of years. It's very unlikely that any of their studio partners would permit those to be available on a free-to-air service. There's a strict windowing structure, so they're out of the picture. And lastly, there's the cannibalisation risk. If you move all your content free, what's going to happen to your paying customer base? Some of them will potentially churn. So what could you do? Well, I mean, effectively, potentially we could look at a Netflix Lite. It doesn't have all the content. Maybe it's got the first seasons of House of Cards, Orange is the New Black, and so on, to try and encourage people to sign up to the paid-for tier. What we're probably not going to see is a Spotify tier where you can basically get access to more or less everything. And then the main encouragement for upgrading is being able to view on multiple devices and without the advertising. So, broadly speaking, I think we're looking at a very different scenario here. And that cannibalisation risk is quite real in some of those saturated markets. So if we look at the US, for instance, about 75% of US internet users watch online TV each month. And TV, what we're not including in this are, have you watched a video on a news website? It's really about longer form content. About 56% of US internet users have watched paid-for video of some sort. So that could be Netflix, it could be one of its rivals, Amazon Prime, Hulu or Hulu Plus, or other services like that. About 45% of them have watched Netflix. So what that leaves is effectively you've got an incremental reach of somewhere between about 19 and 30%. So basically the difference between either Netflix or the paid-for video, and that's 75%. So in terms of the incremental market that you're going to gain from moving to an ad-supported tier, potentially not that huge in some of the most developed markets. So my contention here would be, well, perhaps it's more applicable to move to some sort of ad-funded free tier model in some of the lower penetration markets. So perhaps some of the markets that are more piracy orientated. So we might see, perhaps a bit too early to say, but Southern Europe, for instance, low willingness to pay typically. So we'll see how Netflix pans out there, but that could be an option there. So last thing I want to point out is actually moving into advertising adds a whole new set of costs to the company. So Netflix is a very lean company as a whole. So what I've plotted here is their annual revenues relative to a few alternative media companies versus the number of employees in each group. So if we look at Netflix, in terms of their annual revenue, somewhere approaching $7 billion versus Sky on a little bit more, RTL on a little bit less, ITV on about a third. But if you look at the employee profile, you've got 25,000 for Sky, you've got nearly 6,000 for RTL, and nearly 5,000 for ITV. Yet Netflix has 2,200. So they have a lean company profile. Are they really going to want to deploy extensive local teams to support advertising? Because ultimately, making a success of advertising, particularly in competition with domestic broadcasters, is a local competition issue. So what does that leave? Well, it does mean Netflix is a large global company. It could just focus on the US, or it could make a few international deals with large advertisers or brands. Or it could move into a more data-driven strategy. Would we be looking maybe at a Netflix private exchange? All options. So to sum up, current consumption is placing Netflix on par with major broadcast channels in terms of viewing in some markets. So over the next few years, as Netflix subscribers continue to grow, we'll start to see that occur in more and more territories. The subscriber demographics for their core customer base is pretty attractive. They're young, high spend, ABC One skew. And if it did move into advertising funded models, particularly some of the more severe ones that we looked at in this presentation, the impact on the incumbents could be pretty significant. If you insert an ABC's worth of inventory into the market, what's that going to do to all the competition? But reasons to be positive. So there's no immediate requirement for them to boost their growth. What we're really looking at is the growth is still going to start to slow down 2017, 2018. So that's probably, these sorts of conversations are probably unlikely to be happening for another couple of years. The lean company profile, as I've just mentioned, means that these large local ad sales teams, I'd say probably unlikely. It's likely to take a different approach. So rather than stocking up in all the local and regional offices. An entirely ad-funded tier is unlikely to hit in some of its core territories. I suspect they're more likely to go and try and boost payment and the monthly average revenues per customer in their core territories. But that's not to say it's not going to have an effect anyway. The current consumption trends means that it's competing for eyeballs, whether it moves into advertising or not. So that concludes the presentation. You're welcome to drop me an email, but any questions now? I think there's a roving microphone. Oh, someone at the back. So the microphone's just getting passed over.
Hi, it's Jeff Hills at Sky. Just interested in the work you did in the comparison between the average viewing of 4.5 hours a day against 2 hours a day potentially watched for Netflix. Mm-hmm. If Barb potentially isn't measuring Netflix, that means that everybody's watching 6.5 hours of TV a day?
No, so that 2.5 hours is expressed on a per Netflix account basis. So in the US, basically, if you're looking at about 40% penetration, it's maybe going to add about an hour of consumption a day to the US market. In the UK, both because consumers are watching less Netflix per account, and there are fewer subscribers, that's going to add substantially less in terms of on top of that existing viewing. But, I mean, it's an interesting point that I think we've seen in the US a few of the big broadcast channels saying that their viewing's really been hit, and some of them have been attributing that to the wide amount of content on Netflix. So, there is a competition challenge there for some of them.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Richard. That's fascinating. We do need to move on, but maybe we'll pick up some of those questions later as well. Thank you.